Transylvanian Sunrise. By Radu Sinamar with Peter Moon. By the age of 3, the child had suffered from no diseases, which is a very rare occurrence. This made the imposed task of first informing the Securitate services and not going to hospital somewhat easier. At about that age, the first major change came up in the relation between Cesar's parents. As Cesar told me, his mother had a great passion for drawing and her talent was manifest. Deep down, she would have liked to paint, but that would have meant financial complications, a dedicated studio, time and much else besides that. She had therefore limited her passion to simple sketches and amusements that would cheer up her moments of loneliness. She would keep her drawings about the house or sometimes pin the finest of them to the wall. And they would stay there until they would fall or she herself would replace them. Smiranda had a propensity for abstract drawings that combined lines, circles or curves in patterns with apparently no clear idea. She used to tell her husband those drawings made her feel very spontaneous and free, which had a bracing effect on her. One day, Smiranda Brad drew a series of simple concentric circles in the middle of a blank page in a drawing notebook. She amused herself by comparing her creation with the pattern of a target. As the circles were almost perfect, she stuck the page to a wall in one of the rooms. Everything started several hours later when she found Cesar seated in front of the drawing and staring at it without moving or blinking. Although that was not quite natural, Cesar's mother did not attach too much importance to the event and continued to mind her work about the house. But when Nikolai Brad came back from work, the child was still sitting in front of the drawing, perfectly still and silent. The occurrence was fairly strange, a 3-year-old baby seated on the bed and staring for hours in a row at an irritatingly simple drawing while his mother was wringing her hands by his side, crying silently and not knowing what to do. She had tried to force him away from the drawing and had even unstuck it from the wall, but to no avail. When bothered, the child started screaming out loud. The two parents looked at each other for a long while with no need for words. At last, Cesar's father said, "It's time we called them. Who knows what's next?" "Wait." Smiranda started fretting about. "We should allow some more time. It may only be a child's mood." It was with much difficulty that she talked him into not revealing anything yet. Very worried, they spent the rest of the day testing various methods in an attempt to take Cesar's attention away from that drawing. They were thus hoping to bring him back to normality, but all their attempts failed. As soon as he was disturbed, Cesar started screaming, crying, and there was no way they could handle him any longer. They eventually gave up and then watched him for a long while, almost in disbelief that something like that was at all possible. Their child was staring at the drawing, without moving or blinking. He had not eaten anything and showed no sign he would want to. Nothing around could take him out of the concentrated efforts he was making. At about 10 o'clock in the evening, Nikolai Brad called Colonel Datku and told him about the situation. Colonel Datku instructed them not to panic or do anything until he himself came to their house together with some authorized persons. Indeed, at about 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 men arrived with Colonel Datku. 2 of them were from the Securitate, bearing the same unmistakable appearance, stiff faces, dapper suits, cold looks. The third person looked peculiar to the parents. He was an elderly man with Asian traits, a short white beard and a somewhat forward-leaning walk. He was talking in English with one of the Securitate men. Colonel Datku introduced him as a scientist from China who was an expert on such cases and advised the parents not to worry. The Chinese doctor watched Cesar carefully, felt his pulse, touched his palms in an odd manner, and placed one hand on the top of his head and 2 fingers in the middle of his forehead, being careful not to step into the visual field of the child. Through all of this, Cesar kept perfectly still and remained deeply absorbed in the drawing in front of him. The doctor said something in English and then scuttled out of the house. "Everything is perfectly fine, but you must not disturb him," translated one of the Securitate men. "We'll be in touch through Colonel Datku." That was all, and they immediately left. The parents felt like two mere puppets in a complicated play, but circumstances were such that they had no other option. Worried and deeply concerned about the strange behavior of their child, they stayed with him, dozing off with fatigue. It was only the following day at noon, after almost 24 hours, that Cesar showed the first sign he wanted to stand up. The child continued to be, but at least he ate heartily. His parents and informed Colonel Dactu of the change. That was the beginning of a series of left a definitive mark on Cesar's life. And Smiranda Brad moved into the background as his inner life and the extraordinary experiences he had been through, some of which he personally told me about so that I could describe them here, would profoundly mark his destiny. After that unusual event, Cesar would often sink within himself and be perfectly still for minutes in a row. His deep within himself gave a sigh of relief. Special events which his parents, Nikolai, eyes closed, that used to happen at the most unexpected moments of the day, even when he was at play. Once, while his mother was feeding him, he suddenly closed his eyes and stayed like that for more than 10 minutes, after which he continued to eat as if nothing had happened. Those feats had already become part of ordinary life and his parents had grown used to them, but they did not understand the causes and were given no explanations or clarifications since, by that time, Cesar had not spoken a word. The change occurred 2 months after the drawing event when, for the first time in his life, Cesar spoke. His words left everyone around the house at that time gaping with perplexity, both at the ease and clarity with which he spoke those words and at the maturity of his ideas. That day, relatives who loved the child dearly were the Brads. More of a recluse, the child was looking for a place where he could be alone for a while. He closed his eyes, but everywhere around there was too much talk, too much noise, and too many questions. Everybody was fretting about and, although he was not the center of attention, preparing the meal involved much movement, talk, laughter and bustle. When they came to bring him to the room where the table was laid, all caressing and fondling him, Cesar said clearly, "I want to think. I will move quickly past the huge surprise and joy those words brought to everybody around." Cesar had started to speak fluently and without any difficulty as of that moment, showing maturity in everything he said. By age 4, he used to talk about matters that even adults would find puzzling. The mind was one of the issues he liked to dwell upon. Where do thoughts come from? Where do they go? What are they made of? Why don't all people think the same thoughts? These were only a few of the most frequent questions Cesar would ask, to the puzzlement of those around. His poor parents were at a loss for answers. They would send him out to play or change the subject, but most of the time, Cesar was steadfast in his determination. As opposed to the usual activities of a child his age, he preferred sinking into thought. Strangely though, he would obstinately refuse to explain or answer when often asked to tell what he felt or thought in those moments. On very rare occasions, however, he would say that, after closing his eyes, he felt as if he was suddenly leaving the room, but he did not know how to speak about the place of his destination or how he could describe it in words. By the age of 6, Cesar had been visited once a year by the 2 Securitate men in the company of the mysterious Chinese doctor. The latter would give him a summary examination, always nodding his head in a pleased manner, or would stare at the boy's eyes with his fiery look. Cesar told me he could very well remember that almost impersonal, tough and profoundly enigmatic look of the little man in front of him with only the touch of a smile on his face. He was to meet him later, after several years, and learn from him, unexpectedly, many mysteries of life, as destiny had brought the two of them together in a very complex manner. Perhaps we shall never know what Dr. Sheehan was thinking when watching Cesar, or what he was making of the child's unusual capacities. What we know for sure is that he later played an extremely important part in the boy's existence and had a correct intuition of his exceptional abilities and gifts. It is actually very likely that he himself had supernormal capacities and powers, and that Cesar's achievements as one of his students were such as to confirm this likelihood almost without a trace of doubt. Several years later, Dr. Sheehan had a decisive hand in the special training of the boy. I am not in possession of more information about this enigmatic character, but from the little information Cesar did reveal, I was able to gather that Ceausescu, then Romania's dictator, was interested at the time in a certain parapsychology training program and in the use of its subjects in highly secret cases of national interest. He seemed to have been influenced by some piece of intelligence that drew his attention to intensive research and parapsychological experiments conducted at that time in the USA and the USSR. In his capacity as Supreme Commander of the state, Ceausescu issued an order that a special department be set up within the Securitate Service for the recruitment, training and development of human subjects with unusual abilities. The order involved absolute secrecy of the kind that was many levels above simple classified information. Due to a method known as hierarchical intelligence blockage, no special difficulty came up in maintaining secrecy about the new department, but a lot was still to be done about staff and logistics. As with almost any communist initiative, progress was cumbersome when it came to investments, particularly in a field about which little was known. It is not clear what purpose Ceausescu wanted this new parapsychological line of action to serve, but one could surmise he mostly targeted those procedures for psychic manipulation and influence over the masses with a view to maintaining dictatorial power and, to a lesser degree, issues like national defense or external conflict resolution. Ceausescu ordered the establishment of that department in 1968, shortly after his arrival to power, thus able to achieve maximum benefits out of his popularity in the West, at that time on the ascendant. His widespread diplomatic success was the result of two principal aspects: his almost outspoken hostility to cooperation with Moscow and his opposition to armed intervention in the famous Prague Spring of 1968. Back then, however, Ceausescu's order that a special department be set up to conduct research and experiments on subjects of exceptional abilities was curious and even contradictory in some of its aspects. This could lead to the conclusion that he himself was more dallying with an idea that was promisingly brewing somewhere at the back of his mind rather than placing it high on his priority list. Still, much like any cunning personality of paranoid disposition, Ceausescu wanted to surround himself at any cost with certainties and means that would secure an indisputable problem-free domination. Obviously, he could not develop all his different ideas to the same extent, but he used to come back to each and every one of them, bring what a long while before was only a bud to a radiant bloom. In 1968, the Romanian Securitate was confronted with a top-secret order that was not in line with the usual issuance standards. The order was dated August 28, bore Ceausescu's personal signature and, in an extremely rare occurrence, was accompanied by some personal notes. The decree requested the establishment of a special department, called Department 0, to operate independently from the other departments and units in the Securitate service of those times and report directly and only to the head of the service and the president of the country. That was mentioned in the very note Ceausescu had written, which was drawing attention both to the top-secret nature of the order and to the way in which it had to be followed. However, the decree was economical with information other than a very concise personnel grid and minimal instructions on the main lines of action which, at the beginning, involved recruitment and surveillance methods in relation to future subjects. The decree put the then management structure of the Securitate service in a difficult position since, on the one hand, it was about a relatively novel and untested field, and, on the other hand, they could not follow the standard financing procedure for reasons of absolute secrecy. When Department 0 was in the early days of its operation, Ceausescu's agreement was sought in cooperation with another state with a certain track record in the field, China. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were quite good and, in 1972, the authorities agreed on a somewhat strange exchange. Dr. Xian was to run and set the technical structure of the department in Romania for a period of 15 years, while Ceausescu was to finance scholarships for 100 Chinese students to Romania for the same duration. China also volunteered to make available to the personnel in Department 0, known as DZ, some of the findings of its parapsychological experiments as well as other useful working methods. The agreement thus laid the groundwork for one of the most secret and terrible human actions in Romania, the parapsychological method. Cesar Brad was one of the first subjects recruited and registered with DZ, however, not even Dr. Xian or those in high positions in the department, who got those written reports from his parents, were aware of details or of the subtle experiences of the child, particularly those details of an inner nature. Cesar would not talk about these to anyone. The method DZ employed first involved a period of probation and supervision of the subject. Only after proving to be of exceptional psychic abilities would subjects be integrated into the structure of the department. Sometimes this probation and checks period could last years in a row, as was the case with Cesar. At other times, however, the subject would be integrated immediately after the information received was checked. Cesar had found a mental experimental world of his own into which he liked to sink deeper and from which he would return enriched with extraordinary sensations and perceptions. It was not one of those worlds where one might think Cesar was seeking refuge for reasons like some hypothetical psychic adaptation difficulties or even some sort of mental alienation. On the contrary, the truth was different. The very fact that we cannot grasp what is well above our actual capacities does not mean that that thing, being, behavior or experience is a negative or condemnable aspect, or that, worse, it does not exist. Cesar Brad's case was strange. Back then, little was understood and accepted about it, even by DZ staff. His case, however, did match the pattern required for the recruitment of DZ subjects. I must confess I myself am aware of only some of the amazing achievements and experiences Cesar had in the early years of his childhood. Generally speaking, I think of myself as a self-composed, self-collected individual, but Cesar's stories were far above my imagination. Of course, when listening to him tell me about his experiences, what was there in front of my eyes was neither an emotionally unstable human being nor a science fiction writer nor a paranoid. To those with some knowledge of things esoteric and who are still in key positions in the structures of the state or have access to top-secret information and archives, the quick identification of the main elements of the story in this book may not be difficult. But to the remainder, that is to most people who are practically bereft of correct information and subjected on an almost permanent basis to a spate of conflicting data and stories, holding a coherent common-sense personal view has become quite difficult. By dint of my position as a government advisor that I held a few years ago, I could do some discreet research and see for myself, based upon my own observation and intuitions, that Cesar Brad was an exceptional character. The modesty with which he told me about his main experiences and activities, as well as some telling little incidents I myself was confronted with in his presence, gradually convinced me of a reality that could not be denied, namely, that some human beings are far above our conceptual, mental or organizational standards. If they so choose, these human beings can transform other people's destinies through the power of their superior abilities. One indisputable proof of Cesar's abilities came with our very first meeting, which he requested some years ago. The meeting was the result of some complex arrangements among trustworthy persons, but its main purpose was still a mystery to me. I was vaguely aware of Department 0 within today's Romanian Intelligence Service, RIS, but that was all. I arrived at the place of the meeting straight from work in one of the institution's cars. It was nighttime and pouring with rain, so I stayed inside chatting with the driver. After several minutes the car door suddenly opened and, skipping all formality, Cesar sat himself beside me on the back seat and started to talk amiably and very calmly, getting straight to the point.